1. Comment reopened an old Warriors wound. One Instagram comment may have just ripped open a Warriors wound that never completely healed. Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green once stood together at the center of one of basketball's most feared dynasties. They celebrated championships together, destroyed opponents together, and created a team the NBA still uses as the measuring stick for super teams. But now, one debate about another stacked roster has suddenly turned those championship memories into ammunition. It started when Durant compared his old Golden State situation to the new-look Philadelphia roster described in this story. His larger argument was simple. When he joined Stephen Curry, Klay, and Draymond, people said the Warriors were unfair. So why wouldn't another roster loaded with elite scorers face the same criticism? But Durant didn't stop with the comparison. When challenged online, he broke down his former teammates individually, pointing to Klay's scoring numbers and emphasizing that Thompson had never been an MVP candidate. He also reduced Draymond's contribution to a traditional stat line while arguing that Golden State wasn't necessarily superior on paper. That was the moment the conversation changed. Klay saw his full name being used in Durant's argument and responded publicly, essentially asking why his former teammate was suddenly talking about him that way. He didn't launch into a statistical defense. He didn't write an essay. His response was short, and that made it hit even harder. Then Draymond entered the conversation with one burner account joke aimed at Durant. An argument about basketball history suddenly became something much more personal. Now, fans weren't just comparing rosters. They were digging up championship photos, old interviews, emotional tributes, and footage of Durant and Klay celebrating together. And that created the uncomfortable question hanging over everything. How did three men who helped build a dynasty end up publicly taking shots at each other nearly a decade later? Maybe this is nothing more than competitive, former teammates getting under each other's skin, or maybe Durant's comment exposed feelings that never completely disappeared after Golden State's dynasty broke apart. Where are you watching from? If you think Durant crossed the line by bringing Klay and Draymond into his argument, come on. If you think Durant was simply making a basketball comparison that got taken too personally, come on, dude, subscribe to the channel. Because the next part reveals why one specific line about Klay transformed this from an NBA debate into something personal. The line that made Klay fire back. The moment Kevin Durant's argument stopped feeling like a normal basketball debate was the moment he singled out Klay Thompson up to that point. Fans could argue about super teams' scoring power and whether one roster looks stronger on paper, but once Durant reduced Klay to a stat line and pointed out that he had never been an MVP candidate, the tone changed immediately. Because Klay was never just another name on Durant's old roster. He was one of the players who shared the floor with Durant during the most dominant years of Golden State's dynasty. He sacrificed touches, accepted a role that didn't require him to control the ball, and built his value around movement, shooting, defense, and spacing. His job was never to chase MVP votes. His job was to make Steph Curry and Durant even harder to guard. That is why the comment hit differently. Durant may have been trying to prove that the current Philadelphia roster described in the story has more decorated individual talent on paper. But when he used Klay as evidence, it sounded less like analysis and more like dismissal. Klay's response was short. He did not pull up his championships. He did not remind Durant about his 3 7-point quarter, his 6 0-point game, or his record-setting shooting nights. He did not turn the exchange into a stat war. Instead, he questioned the tone. That was what made the response so effective. Klay was not really asking for a basketball explanation. He was asking why someone who shared championship moments with him was suddenly talking about him like a stranger. And fans immediately understood the subtext. They began comparing Durant's new words with old footage of the two celebrating together, old photos of Klay embracing Durant during finals runs, and old messages where Klay publicly praised Durant's importance to the Warriors. The contrast was brutal. Years ago, Klay called Durant essential to what Golden State built. Now, Durant was using Klay's lack of MVP consideration as a talking point. That contradiction became the emotional center of the story. And before the debate had time to cool down, Draymond Green jumped into the middle of it. Draymond Green makes it messier. If Klay's response gave the story emotion, Draymond Green gave it gasoline. Durant had already mentioned Draymond in the same comparison, reducing his production to points, rebounds, and assists, while arguing that Golden State did not necessarily look stronger on paper for a player whose entire career has been built around doing things that rarely appear cleanly in a box score. That framing was almost guaranteed to get a reaction. Draymond's answer was short, sharp, and completely on brand. Instead of defending his stats, he went after Durant's social media history. The burner account joke instantly shifted the conversation away from basketball and toward one of Durant's oldest online controversies. That is why the line traveled so quickly. It referenced something fans already understood, and it turned Durant's own habit of engaging online into part of the story. Now, the situation had three voices. Durant was defending his legacy. Klay was questioning why a former teammate was talking about him that way. Draymond was mocking the way Durant had chosen to make the argument, and that combination created the feeling of an old locker room suddenly being reopened in public. The history between Durant and Draymond makes that especially important. Their Warriors years were filled with winning, but they were never free of tension. The two had already been associated with one of the most famous teammate confrontations of that era, and their relationship has remained complicated in the years since. So when Draymond entered this new exchange, fans were not reading it as a random joke. They were reading it through years of history. That is what made the entire situation feel bigger than one Instagram comment. Every new line came attached to an old memory. Every joke reopened another chapter, and every response made fans wonder whether these three former champions had ever fully agreed on how that dynasty should be remembered. The irony is that Durant's original point was supposed to be about another team entirely, but the more the argument spread, the less anyone cared about Philadelphia. The real story had become Golden State, and to understand why Durant kept pushing the comparison, you have to understand the wound he has carried since 2016. Durant's real argument was bigger than Klay. Kevin Durant's real target was never just Klay Thompson, it was history. More specifically, it was the way his 2016 decision to join Golden State has been judged for almost a decade. When Durant left Oklahoma City for a Warriors team that had just won 73 games, the reaction was immediate and relentless. Fans called it unfair. Analysts questioned the competitive balance of the league. Critics argued that Durant had joined a finished machine instead of building one himself. And even after 2 championships and 2 finals MVPs, that criticism never fully disappeared. That is the lens through which Durant appears to view this new comparison. According to the story, when he looked at Philadelphia's new collection of star power, he saw something familiar. Multiple elite scorers, major individual awards, and the possibility of another super team forming around established stars. So Durant pushed back. His argument was essentially this: if his Warriors were treated like a basketball cheat code, why should another loaded roster escape the same scrutiny? That point can be debated, but the problem was how he chose to make it. Instead of simply saying the new team had more individual star power, Durant began listing the limitations of his former teammates. Klay became not an MVP candidate, Draymond became a modest scoring line, and suddenly Durant's attempt to defend his own legacy sounded like it came at the expense of the people who helped him win. That is why the reaction became so personal. Durant was trying to revisit the judgment around his own decision. Klay and Draymond were hearing their value reduced in the process. Those are two completely different emotional experiences, and once that distinction became clear, the argument stopped being about whether Durant's logic was technically defensible. It became about loyalty. How do you make a point about your own legacy without minimizing the people who shared the championship stage with you? That question is what turned a simple roster comparison into something that fans could not stop discussing. Because nearly 10 years later, the 2016 Warriors are still not just a team. They are a reference point for how the NBA talks about power, fairness, sacrificio, and legacy. Why the 2016 Warriors comparison still hurts? The reason the 2016 Warriors keep coming back into these debates is simple. They changed the standard. Before Durant arrived, Golden State had already won a championship, returned to the finals, and produced a 7-3 win regular season. Steph Curry had become an MVP. Klay Thompson had established himself as one of the league's most dangerous shooters. Draymond Green had become the defensive and emotional engine of the team. Then Durant joined them. That is why critics never treated the move like a normal free agent decision. He was not joining potential, he was joining a proven powerhouse. And that distinction matters when people compare those Warriors to any new super team that exists only on paper. The Philadelphia roster described in the story may feature enormous individual credentials, but that does not automatically make it stronger than a team that had already dominated the league before adding another MVP-level scorer. That is the center of the counter-argument against Durant. A collection of famous names is not the same thing as a proven machine. Fit matters. Health matters. Chemistry matters. Timing matters. The 2016 Warriors already knew how to win together. Durant was inserted into an ecosystem that had been tested under playoff pressure. That is why the comparison creates such strong emotions for Durant. The Warriors label can feel like a permanent attempt to discount what he accomplished. For everyone else, the team's greatness is exactly why his decision remains controversial. Those two perspectives have never fully reconciled, and every time another super team appears, the argument starts again. Was Durant judged too harshly? Or was the Golden State situation genuinely different because the team was already historically dominant? There is no easy answer, but the debate becomes much more complicated when Durant tries to make his old teammates look less accomplished in order to strengthen his case. Because Klay and Draymond were not passengers, they were part of the reason Golden State was already terrifying before Durant arrived. And once fans started reminding everyone of that fact, the discussion shifted from legacy to basketball value. That is where the numbers stopped being enough. Was Durant undervaluing Klay and Draymond? This is where the argument becomes unfair if you only look at traditional statistics. Klay Thompson's value was never defined by MVP voting. During Golden State's peak, he played beside Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, two of the most gifted scorers of their generation. Of course, his individual ceiling was going to look different in that environment. But Klay's job was not to dominate possessions. His job was to destroy defensive spacing. A defender could not leave him. A weak side rotation could become 3 points. A moment of hesitation could become a 1-0 point run before the other team even realized what happened. That kind of pressure does not always show up in a box score, but it changes every possession, and Klay's resume still speaks loudly. Championships, all-star appearances, historic shooting performances, a 3-7 point quarter, a 6-0 point game in limited minutes, and one of the most feared catch-and-shoot profiles the league has ever seen. Then there is Draymond. If you judge him only by points per game, you miss almost everything that made him valuable. His defense was built on anticipation, switches, communication, help positioning, reading actions before they develop. He connected Golden State's offense and defense in ways that traditional statistics struggle to measure. That is why Durant's framing triggered so much pushback. It flattened two highly specialized championship players into basic numbers, and that is not how championship teams work. Not every great player needs to score 30. Not every essential player needs MVP votes. Sometimes the players who make a dynasty function are the ones whose value becomes most obvious when they are removed. Klay gave Golden State spacing without demanding the ball. Draymond gave the team defensive intelligence and emotional edge. Steph gave the system gravity. Durant gave it overwhelming scoring power. The dynasty worked because those pieces fit. So when Durant reduced Klay and Draymond to statistical comparisons, fans saw it as something deeper than a bad take. They saw it as rewriting the formula of the team that helped him win, and that is when the old footage started becoming evidence. Old championship footage changes the meaning. The internet did what it always does. When a new argument involves old teammates, it went digging. Within hours, championship photos started resurfacing. Clips of Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson celebrating together, highlights of them combining for huge scoring nights, images of Klay with his arm around Durant during finals runs, and one of the most powerful reminders came from Klay's own words years earlier, when he publicly praised Durant's sacrifice and importance to Golden State's championships. That old message suddenly looks completely different. Back then, Klay was defending Durant. Now, Durant was being criticized for minimizing Klay. The emotional contrast was almost too perfect. Old joy on one side, fresh friction on the other. And that is why the footage spread so aggressively. Fans were not just trying to prove who was right, they were trying to understand how the relationship changed. The clips did not show enemies. They showed teammates who trusted each other in the biggest moments of their careers. That is what made the current exchange feel uncomfortable. You can argue with a stranger online and nobody cares. But when two men who share championship pressure begin questioning each other publicly, every old image becomes part of the story. Even routine highlights started carrying new, meaning a celebration became evidence of old respect. A sideline interaction became something fans analyzed for hidden tension. An old scoring explosion became a rebuttal to the idea that Klay was somehow secondary. Nothing about the footage itself had changed. The context had. That is what makes sports nostalgia so powerful. History is never static. A new argument can completely change the way old moments are remembered. And the more those clips circulated, the less this looked like a simple disagreement over basketball. It started looking like a public debate over who deserves credit for one of the greatest dynasties ever assembled. Then another piece of Durant's past got pulled into the discussion, the burner account history. The burner account history comes back again? Draymond Green's joke worked because he did not have to explain it. Fans already understood the reference. Kevin Durant has a long public history of engaging directly with criticism online. And past controversies involving alternate or anonymous accounts have become part of his social media reputation. That history is why Draymond's burner account jab spread so quick. It was not just a random insult. It connected this new argument to an older storyline that fans already associated with Durant. And once that happened, the conversation became even harder for Durant to control. Now, people were not just debating his point about the Warriors. They were debating the way he handles criticism. They were pulling old screenshots. They were revisiting previous controversies. They were turning one new comment into part of a much larger pattern. That is the danger of social media for public figures. A single sentence rarely stays isolated. Everything becomes searchable. History, every old controversy becomes available again. And when a former teammate knows exactly which pressure point will trigger the internet, one short joke can become louder than a full explanation. Still, it is important to separate the different layers of the story. The uploaded script references both past admitted use of alternate accounts and newer allegations circulating online. Those are not automatically the same thing. An allegation should not be treated as proven simply because they fit an existing narrative. But from a storytelling perspective, perception was enough. Fans already knew the history. Draymond knew the history, and that gave his response instant context. The result was another shift. Durant's original basketball point became increasingly buried underneath everything surrounding it. The discussion was now about Klay's legacy, Draymond's value, burner accounts, Golden State history, and whether Durant still carries resentment over the way people talk about his championships. At that point, the debate had become too big for the three former teammates to control. The rest of the NBA world started choosing sides. The NBA world picked sides. Once the exchange went viral, the argument fractured in every direction. Some fans sided with Klay and Draymond immediately. Their position was simple. Durant could have defended his own legacy without reducing the contributions of two teammates who helped him win championships. Others defended Durant. They argued that his larger point was being ignored, that he was comparing individual star power on paper, not claiming Klay was a bad player or Draymond was unimportant. Then analysts entered the discussion and shifted the focus again. One of the strongest counter-arguments centered on the difference between proven dominance and hypothetical talent. The Warriors team Durant joined had already won at the highest level. The new Philadelphia roster described in the story had not yet played together. That matters. Awards do not guarantee chemistry. Scoring averages do not guarantee fit. 4 famous names do not automatically become a historically great team. That became the weakness in Durant's comparison. He was using individual resumes to compare one roster with another. While critics were using actual team performance, both sides were measuring different things, and that is why the argument never reached a clean conclusion. Even LeBron's silence became part of the conversation. According to the source, he had not publicly entered the exchange, leaving Durant, Klay, and Draymond to battle over a comparison triggered by the new roster around him. That silence may have been the smartest response of all, because by this point, the debate was barely about Philadelphia anymore. It was about memory. Who gets credit for the Warriors dynasty? How much should Durant's championships change his legacy? Was Klay undervalued because he played beside 2 superstars? Was Draymond's impact impossible to capture with traditional stats? And underneath all of those questions sits something more personal. Do these 3 former teammates still respect each other? The source itself leaves that unresolved. None of the responses necessarily prove a permanent fracture. The tone can still be read as old teammates getting under each other's skin rather than genuine hatred. But once championship history becomes public ammunition, the line between friendly tension and real resentment gets harder to see. And that is exactly why this story refuses to disappear. Legacy, loyalty, and what this really means. At the end of all this, the biggest story is not really about one Instagram comment. It is about how championship teams are remembered once the winning stops and the players who built them begin telling the story from different perspectives. Kevin Durant has every right to defend his legacy. For nearly a decade, his decision to join Golden State has been used as an argument against him, even after 2 championships and 2 finals MVP awards. From his point of view, comparing that Warriors team with another loaded roster is a way of challenging what he believes has been a double standard. But there is also a lesson in how that argument is made. Klay Thompson and Draymond Green were not disposable pieces in Durant's success. Klay's shooting, movement, and willingness to sacrifice touches helped create the spacing that made Golden State almost impossible to defend. Draymond's defense, communication, playmaking, and emotional intensity connected everything together. Their value cannot be measured only by MVP votes or points per game. That is the strategic lesson every championship organization should remember. Talent creates possibility, but fit creates dominance. Steph Curry, Durant, Klay, and Draymond were devastating because their abilities complemented each other. Remove the sacrifice, trust, and role acceptance, and the same collection of talent might never have become a dynasty. There is a human lesson here too. Former teammates do not have to agree about everything that happened years ago. Competitive people will remember moments differently. But history becomes more meaningful when success is acknowledged without diminishing the people who helped create it. Respect does not require silence, and disagreement does not need to become hostility. Maybe Durant lied, and Draymond eventually laugh about this together. Maybe the tension stays underneath the surface. Either way, 2 championships they shared cannot be erased by a few social media posts. And perhaps that is why this story became so fascinating. The old footage and the new comments can both be true. These players can have tremendous respect for what they accomplished together while still carrying frustrations about how that era is remembered. Now, I want your opinion. If you believe Durant went too far by minimizing Klay and Draymond while defending his own legacy, come on. If you believe his basketball argument was fair and the response became bigger than he intended, come on, like the video, share it with another NBA fan, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from, because nearly a decade later, the Warriors dynasty is still creating arguments. Nobody can completely settle